Okay, so a little bit disconcerting to not see most of the audience, but of course it's nice to have the true people, the people who are truly present here as well. So thank you first to Lex and Doreen for organizing this. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to come to Amsterdam whenever, but in real life especially. And before I go any further, just a brief disclaimer, I'm appearing on my free time, so my views do not necessarily reflect those of my academic hosts and employers. So there are a few real people here. I'd like to ask a few questions, if you could raise your hands. Who amongst you has a PhD? Okay, so a few people. Have you ever tried to correct somebody else's paper? Okay. Keep your hand up if it was easy. Okay. So scientific progress of all sorts. So here I'm speaking about, all scientific endeavor. We're not at all, for now, getting into questions of the dark side of science or hijacking websites. Just scientific progress requires discussion, analysis, confrontation of ideas, criticism as well. And there are a number of ways in which to do this. So there are the informal ways you discuss with your colleagues. These days you can blog about them, you can write a review. And science in general is supposed to be self-correcting as part of that progress. So when problems are, if any problems are identified, the typical, let's say the traditional means of acting to correct those problems, to make progress, would be to write a new article, write a letter to the editor. Some journals have commenting systems. But if you've ever tried to make use of any of those methods, you'll realize that they're really quite restricted, dispersed, slow, ephemeral sometimes, and it's generally quite difficult to correct science. So why that might be, I'll come to in a second, but I quite like to slide in a paraphrased quote from Max Planck, who opined that science progresses one funeral at a time. So you kind of have to wait for the powerful people to die, for new ideas to supplant the old ones. What he actually said was much more complicated, but the idea is that in a nutshell. And as I was saying, there's actually, especially today, with the hyper-competition that we're all subject to, there's a very hostile environment for correcting science. And if you stop to analyze the situation a little bit, you realize that there are a lot of potential conflicts of interest, at least, at every level. Authors don't like to admit they're wrong. Journals don't like to damage their brand by admitting they're wrong, and institutions hate that too. So we're left with Upton Sinclair's very clear insight that it's very difficult to get a man or woman to understand something when his or her salary depends on them not understanding it. So why not bypass all those conflicts of interest using the revolutionary new technology of the internet? And simply share any useful information, researcher to researcher, bypassing the potentially conflicted intermediaries. And thus was PubPeer born in 2012. And the main founder is actually my colleague Brandon Stell. And he was helped initially by the Smith brothers. And I joined shortly afterwards, informally, and then more formally. In particular, I formalized my role when PubPeer, which was initially run anonymously, became a formalized non-profit foundation, and that's the case today, and that happened in 2015. So it's really very simple. Every article that's published today, and most articles that were published in the past, have an identifier, a digital object identifier, and there are databases that allow us to recover sufficient information to dynamically create a page that represents that paper, so the title, the journal, the authors, and on that page there's a text box. And if you have something to say, you can type your comment in the text box, press submit, and with a delay for moderation, it will be available as soon as it's enabled in any case, on this platform, a centralized platform available worldwide. It's permanent, and it allows anonymity. So we're going to be discussing that in a little while. So what can you discuss? So anything scientific. So again, most people usually are motivated to discuss what they perceive is a problem or something that is unclear in the paper, which can go from perfectly technical details, questions of interpretation, up to and including more serious issues. And just a few examples. So a few years back, there was a lot of excitement about proteins that were supposed to be sensitive to magnetic fields and allow excitation of experimental preparations using magnetic fields, so deep within tissues. And there was some immediate discussion on the site suggesting that the results were not that solid, and there were also some problems of physical plausibility of the work. And users of the website, of course, would have been aware of that immediately, would have had an early warning. But it turns out 4 years later, a more formal replication was performed, and it doesn't work. There are any number of examples of the kinds of things that might be discussed. This is an example fairly close to my heart. It's in actually Nature Materials. They have results where less than one molecule has an effect, which is quite difficult, really, according to current knowledge anyway, but it doesn't seem to trouble anybody at the journal or amongst the authors. But also on PubPeer, enabled perhaps by the protection of anonymity, what appeared on the site was a lot of comments pointing to strange irregularities or regularities in images of scientific data. So in particular in biomedical science, there are a lot of techniques that make use of images, and the biological substrate has quite a lot of variability, and at least for some types of images, you expect a degree of randomness that makes every image more or less unique. And if you spend a bit of time looking at the image that I'm showing here, you'll notice that the bands that represent the separation of a macromolecule on a kind of chromatogram, you'll notice that the bands have quite distinct shapes. That's not unusual. They're very odd shapes often, and they're all the same. Okay, so maybe it was an accident, but none of the authors have ever shown up to explain how that accident happened. And maybe it wasn't an accident, and in a way that's quite amazing because this is in a publication. And take a moment of thought to consider what is the state of mind of somebody who's doing this in public and has the habit of doing that in public. So as the site kind of collected a concentration of this kind of comment, the stakes are quite high. In effect, when you see that, it's impossible not to consider the possibility that the authors have done something naughty. Okay, so they're unhappy about that, and they can't criticize their own work, so they criticize the anonymity of the site. The criticism that's made is that it's anonymous, anything goes. So that was never the case, and it's even less the case now. There's a whole series of guidelines, moderation rules that are applied, and we can go through them briefly. So first of all, comments are really quite restricted. They have to be scientific, they have to be factual, they have to be original, they have to be polite. Has to be relevant to the article. There has to be at least the appearance of supporting an argument. Incredibly important, everything that's said has to be publicly verifiable. Hearsay is not allowed. So you can't just say, I know they cheat in the lab, I spoke to my friend, which makes it actually quite a bad site for whistleblowers from inside a lab. It's just not our job, unfortunately. Anything that implies misconduct has to convince the moderator. The moderator has to believe that there's a duplication of images, and they're quite experienced these days, the moderators. Authors have a permanent right of reply. They're alerted in most cases, and the reply appears with the same prominence in the same place. You can't see the comment without seeing the reply. So that's completely different to, if you're libeled in the Sun newspaper in the UK, 1 year later, on a court case later, you get a small apology on the back page. This is in the same place immediately. We encourage authors to reply. There are facilities for reporting abuse. There's community surveillance. There's a community of users. They do exercise those facilities. It's worth also remembering that we're discussing publications that authors chose to publish and warranted were worth publishing. And the final comment to sum all that up is, with all these guidelines, with the practice of moderation, with the experience of more than 100,000 comments in the database over nearly 10 years, the system works quite well in practice. In theory, it's certainly possible to abuse. In practice, that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. And if you want to allege abuse of the system, please bring a few examples from those 100,000 comments. And I think it's worth making a little distinction with how much of social media works. So there's a good deal of formatting and restriction in what you can say, how you can say it. There's moderation. Everything is read except from trusted users. And there are no information bubbles, okay? So you don't have one gang on the right wing, on the left wing, if you like, on one side or the other, that barely see each other. Everything happens attached to the same thread, so that you can't form an information bubble. And if you don't believe me, I'd like you to meet some of our best salespeople. So if you go back just a year and a half, this tweet appeared. So Donald Trump cited a scientific paper. And when that came out, a lot of people realized there were problems with that scientific paper and the assertion made in this tweet. And sharing the correcting information was an emergency, okay? An hour felt like a long time. Now imagine having to go through the usual channels, okay? You write to the journal. So people did that, and the journal kind of published a correction 6 months later, okay? So it turns out in this particular case, there's a suspicion that the editorial board was quite friendly with the authors. So I'm not going to go into the details. That does happen. Academia is a small world. Try writing to the university. So it turns out that the author of the paper was president of the university recently and still has good connections there. So the official channels really are not much use. And this was an emergency. But the same principle applies to all of your research. If there's a problem in a paper that you're basing your project on, you want to know about it as soon as possible, not when your PhD student has wasted their time. So there's a notion of an early warning for researchers that is really important and is pretty much absent from all other procedures. And we really see PubPeer's role as protecting readers and users of publications, sharing information about questions, not necessarily deep problems, but any questions that people might have, to alert maybe quite experienced users to potential problems. And in the face of the viscosity, at best, of the official channels, it can be really frustrating when you highlight a problem and nothing seems to happen. But please remember, any comment posted on PubPeer is publicly available and is helping any researcher who at least seeks to find out, independently of the inaction of the official channels. So here's another salesman, and he is doing his best to convince you that what you really need is anonymity if you're going to be making a serious criticism of a scientific paper. So this is, I've translated one of the threats he addressed actually to Elizabeth Bick and to me. And the anonymity protects you from career reprisals, from legal threats, and some forms of intimidation. So this person has 1 million followers of sometimes doubtful authenticity on Twitter, but some of them are quite active and unpleasant. Some overall statistics. There are now about 120,000 user comments in the database on about 40,000 papers, so there's more than 1 comment per paper on average. For about 5,000 journals, we have traffic of hundreds of thousands of views per month. It's about 50-50 comments from trusted users and comments from users who are not trusted or new anonymous users, and they are pre-moderated. You can see from the arrow on the kind of graph of historical comment traffic that when we enabled anonymity, then people felt free to make their comments. Although we do receive legal threats, we have been sued directly 0 times out of 120,000 user comments. And overall, our policy is for the content to be useful, and each of these comments was posted by somebody, a person, and they cared about that comment. And that's what makes the comments useful. The inputs to PubPeer, so users, some of the most experienced ones, so probably the most experienced one you'll have heard of anyway is Elizabeth Bick, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. There are some very regular anonymous or pseudonymous commenters. We mirror information from some curation services, Prelight, periodicals, the Science Media Centre in the UK. There's a bidirectional exchange of information with preprint servers, and we've started linking final publications to preprints that had comments. That's a service that nobody else can provide. If journals subscribe to a dashboard or institutions, they can make official communications about investigations they've undertaken, so editorial actions. Also, we draw editorial actions from databases when they're available. People are very welcome to link to blogs they've written if the content is suitable. And we have some amount of Twitter integration, so we embed threads and will alert users when threads are embedded. The outputs, so email alerts to authors, persistent personalized searches are available. So when Lex mentioned hijacking of websites, it's all a little less dramatic than that. We have browser plugins that detect DOIs that have comments, and a small flag is inserted in the web page. But it does look like the web page is giving you that information. So it happens on journal websites, author CVs. It doesn't happen on Google Scholar because they don't show the DOIs. But wherever there is a DOI, then that information is available. And the great advantage of that is that you can be alerted to discussion as you work and browse. You don't have to search for every paper. So there's also the Zotero Reference Manager has a plugin that performs the same function when you're managing your references, so that's really quite useful. I mentioned preprint, that's bidirectional Twitter. There are schemes available for journals, institutions, so they're dashboards, so they require a subscription, and that's how we pay our developer and administrative costs. And with a dashboard, a journal will be alerted whenever there's a comment about one of their papers, and an institution whenever a paper with their affiliation receives comments. So they can keep an eye on discussion about their papers and have early warning maybe of misconduct cases. So here's an example of what Lex calls hijacking, but if you visit PubMed or a journal site, and there's an article with comments, you'll get a little flag inserted. It's no more unpleasant than that. So I've actually, how am I doing for time? 10 minutes. Okay, so in fact, I'm pretty much coming to the end of the talk here, so I can take a little moment over the conclusions, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. So PubPeer aims to accelerate scientific progress. If you think about the official channels for commenting and trying to correct science, they were very slow. Really very slow. If you have to publish a new paper, if they sometimes make you, do a new study to add the bit of discussion you wanted to put in about the previous paper, it's incredibly slow. So here, in the next minute, you can target a particular issue in a paper, very granular feedback, very detailed feedback, and it's available immediately. It's 100% focused on the content. There are no metrics, there's no reputation. Maybe we could do something, but in the end we decided we just want to focus on the substance, on the science, on the content. Okay? Maybe our principal aim in sharing that information is to protect users and readers of articles. Okay? The research is published to be built on, and if there's a potential issue, you can learn about it as soon as possible. PubPeer is not the Wild West. It never was, and it really is not now. So there's been a kind of Wikipediaization of the rules and the regulations. So it's all become a bit more complicated. If you think it's the Wild West, try and post a comment, okay, where you say something naughty. You'll find it's not that easy. And that's part of our policy, just to ensure that the comments are as useful as possible. Okay, so we really want the comments to be useful. We're not interested in volume, or more volume than we have. There's plenty of volume anyway. We're just interested in what comments are there, being useful, and having as many useful comments as possible. Now, in the best of cases, PubPeer really can gather the considered opinions of multiple world experts. So if there's something that's in the news that is really an issue, we're going to centralize a lot of worldwide expertise on that issue. So it's the place to come in that case. You should install the extensions both for your browser and for Zotero, which I can only recommend. That way you'll be alerted as you work without having to perform manual searches. We have all the guidelines to try and make the comments as useful as possible, but there's no guarantee. So please always bring your own expertise to bear when you see there's a comment on PubPeer. Read it, decide for yourself if it's useful. We don't have a higher aim than that. We make it easy to comment. We try and ensure that the comments are relevant and of high quality. But then it's up to the user to find them useful or not. Okay? The fact that there is a PubPeer comment doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you read it and find it useful, it might save your PhD's career. So please do install those plugins for that reason. And finally, if you've analyzed the paper, if you have something to share, some information to share, some insight, we try to make that as easy as possible. Help others by sharing your expertise. And finally, of course, thank you to all our commenters, because the site, if it's of any use to anybody, it is useful because of what people have posted on the site, because of the commentators, amongst others like Elizabeth Bick, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting lecture, Boris. I learned a few new things again, so thanks for that. We have a mic in the room, so if you want to say something, use the mic, maybe ask a question, and we have a few people online. But maybe there's a show of hands. First question, there you go.
Yeah, Willem Schoon at Trouw Daily Newspaper. I'm a science editor. 2 questions on your statistics, if I may. You mentioned the 40K papers being commented in the last 10 years. Could you say something about their spread over scientific fields?
Yes, so clearly the dominant subject matter is biomedical research. but there are growing communities in several other fields. So there's quite an active community in chemistry, for instance, and biomedical in a very broad sense, so as far as psychology. What there's less of, there are some technical, kind of harder science papers, technical papers, maths papers. So every scientific domain has its problems or things that need to be discussed. And it only takes a few dedicated users to make a difference. But clearly the dominant field is biomedical research.
Okay, and the second question is, you mentioned that in 10% of the cases, authors use their right to reply. I can imagine you want to get that figure up to 100%, but what would be a realistic goal for that?
So, indeed, I didn't mention it, but it was on the slide, well spotted. So about 10% of of comments, papers with comments, have a reply from the author. And that number has been going up over time. It is going up. So first of all, the comments that, the replies that are made are not always satisfactory. So there are, I mean, it's a kind of recognized pastime to spot the dog ate my homework kind of replies. If you spend some time looking at some of the comments, you realize there's really not much the authors could say. So, you know, the gel I showed, I mean, what are they going to say? Yes, it's a copy and paste job. So in some senses, you know, there are many cases where the absence of reply is probably an understandable policy from the author's point of view. So it depends a lot on. So in a small number of cases, there really are convincing replies. In most cases, there's not much to say, or they don't want to reply. And there are also comments. There are maybe a minority of comments where, you know, it's a much more kind of discursive thread, and authors are happier then to intervene. What we do is we try and send alerts to the authors. So it's not systematic, not all emails work. We have to restrict to academic emails, which aren't always given either. So, but we try to alert the emails. The authors usually find out about the comments fairly quickly. They know that they can reply. So it's kind of out of our hands, really. I think if authors were less naughty, they might enjoy the discussions more.
Yeah. Okay, let's pick a question from the online audience now. Eric, no surname on this iPad, says, isn't it the case that when journals act upon an incident, repair an error, that's good for their reputation? So how can you explain that so many journals are not responsive? Do they really all not respond, or are there some good examples as well? So
I think there's always some pain involved in admitting an error. So in particular, the kind of high value journals, they kind of set themselves an impossible goal of, you know, really providing definitive perfection, and it's quite difficult to, you know, admit that I think most people find it difficult to admit they're wrong. I mean, maybe I would too, you know. So I think it's quite understandable from a kind of human or political point of view. So a few journals really are very proactive, but they're usually the highest quality journals already. An additional problem is it's extra work, it costs money, they haven't budgeted for it. There's also the reputational problem. So those are feed into the conflicts of interest.
Yeah. The better journals might have the money and the staff to respond as well. Yeah? That's fair enough. There was one question there. Yeah, please go ahead.
Bas van Steensel, Netherlands Cancer Institute. Very nice presentation, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So my question is about your plans to integrate PubPeer with the preprint servers. I find it intriguing. At the same time, I'm wondering how you're going to do this, because preprint servers have a commenting.
Absolutely. So we're just collaborating. So when there are comments on a preprint, we can, in our database, we can signal it as having comments. So if people are using our plugins, they can discover the preprint comments that way. We link back to the preprint server, and they return the courtesy. So when there are PubPeer comments, there's a little flag that indicates that. So that's the state of things. But what's interesting and where we can really add some value is what happens when the preprint is published. The journals generally aren't interested, generally don't link to discussion on PubPeer or preprint servers. So readers of the paper then won't know whether or won't have immediate access to that discussion. So a user of our plugins, we're now able to link the publication to the preprint. So users of the plugin will see that this paper as a preprint had comments and be able to find that information. So that's the main integration we see at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's do another online question here, a very concrete one, bringing it back to the topic of today. Have you any feeling of what the proportion of comments is dealing with research misconduct? Is that 100%? Is that 10%? Or some other figure in between?
Interesting question. So there's I mean, you saw the images. When you see an image like that, I think probably it's misconduct. There's a certain class of problems where the authors should have known better. Maybe they did know better, but we don't really consider it misconduct. So statistical problems, I mean, sometimes, statistical analysis are extraordinarily naive, but somehow that's almost never classed as misconduct or reckless negligence or something like that. But there are also comments that are, genuinely open reviews of papers, quite neutral reviews. But I would say at least a majority, a sizable majority probably of the comments are, if you understand the comment, you think, well, there's a problem there, right? So,
an allegation of
so
misconduct.
I wish the authors wouldn't. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the photograph. If you were less shit, would be less activist. I mean, it's the kind of thing where, it is unpleasant, but that's what's in the paper, right? So
it's not a platform for professional debate.
Well, it is, but there's just so much of the other stuff that it kind of swamps or dominates the impression, right?
I can imagine. It became more or less a whistleblower platform as well, isn't it?
Because nobody else was doing it, really. Yes.
I can imagine. Yeah, but that was not.
So I mean, lots of people have things to say about papers that they don't, and it can be also nice things about paper. Please put that on the site. The authors don't mind nice comments at all, actually, but oddly enough. But
well, there's room for a campaign there, maybe. Sikko.
Hi, Sikko de Knecht. I'm with Utrecht University. When I was still a journalist before this, I installed the plugin, and I found all kinds of interesting things when I was browsing through scientific sites, but also government sites and all kinds of other places like Medium. And now as a policymaker, I also greatly enjoy still having that plugin, so I would recommend everyone to just put it on your computer.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I guess the point I want to make is you don't have to, you don't have to believe anything you read on PubPeer.
No.
In real life, I think usually the comments are useful, and it might just save your bacon. That's the point, really. I mean, so absolutely follow that advice. Thank you very much, and install the plugins.
So my question
it won't cost anything.
That's true.
I was wondering what the uptake of the plugin is, how many downloads you have, and what kind of people are using it, and maybe elaborate on the second and third order effect that the plugin can have.
So I'm not sure of the statistics. So I think probably it's the main one, the Chrome plugin, there's between 12 and 15,000 installations. So it's of the order of few tens of thousands of installations probably altogether. So there's always room for more. We have no further information. We don't collect any information. We have no further information at all about who would be using it or how they would be using it, really. We could probably see what traffic comes into the site from the plugin, but it's not the majority of traffic by any means. So I really can't say much more than that. It's available to the world. Please install it.
Yeah. Well, here's another online question that could have been asked by Sigurd de Knecht, because he's focusing on open science currently. And that is, do you see many comments on open science stuff, like data sets? You mentioned preprints already a little bit. You can comment on that. Registered reports in its early stage, pre-registration and that type of stuff. They don't always get a DOI, I know that, but can you comment on that as well if you want?
So preprints in general attract quite a lot of commentary, so most of that will go on bioRxiv and medRxiv have comments, but arXiv don't, the historical one, but there's not so much discussion there's not so much need for discussion, it seems, on PubPeer for physics. So I'm not sure I've seen comments on a registered report. So obviously their volume must be very low. I mean, and it's just the beginning of
the number is still low as well.
The comments. So we do get preprint comments on preprints directly on PubPeer. So sometimes people are used to it, or they think it has more exposure, or maybe they have an anonymity worry or something like that. But there's occasionally, so Zenodo, for instance, has a DOI for their various products, so including data sets. Occasionally there are comments on those. So it's all possible. If there's a DOI, so books, often scientific books often have DOIs these days. So if there's a DOI, it's available, and an arXiv ID as well. But I think the kind of outputs you mentioned are just very low volume. So in the mass of comments is kind of proportional to the publications, and we just see few examples, I'd say. Yeah,
that's fair enough. Iris, PhD student in research integrity as well.
Hi, thank you. Very nice talk. I had a few questions, but a few of them have already been asked, so I think we are all in this room with the same interests. I was wondering, do you have any idea how many of the PubPeer comments lead to retractions or corrections of papers?
It's something that we could do and may do. I mean, the obvious thing is just to cross that information with the Retraction Watch database. And at least one would have an approximation. Were there comments before a retraction? So the overall impression, which has got a bit better, but the overall impression is that there are thousands and thousands of comments, serious comments about papers on PubPeer, and on average, nobody does anything. Okay, that's the overall impression, and that's why PubPeer is, and probably will remain necessary for quite a while, is you have no other way of finding out about those problems as a researcher, as a user of the research. So investigations, research justice, if you like, is very random. Very, very random. There's no regularity. You know, occasionally something will blow up, something will happen. They might, shoot the postdoc, but there's no guarantee of anything happening. Even if there is a journal correction, sometimes it's not totally convincing either, often actually. So 10–15% maybe. So of course Elizabeth has actually great statistics on this, so she has a much clearer sample as well. So you can ask Elizabeth that question again.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. You have something to say about it, I'm sure. Let me plug in a question of my own. I'm still a little bit puzzled that when you enabled the anonymous mode, PubPeer grew so enormously. Is that still the case, that only few comments are named, or is that balance different now?
still the great majority of comments are anonymous in one way or another. So regular users can keep a pseudonym, and the advantage for them is with some loss of security maybe that they have a persistent character and they can become trusted by the moderators. And once they're trusted, then their comments appear immediately and will be moderated if there's a report or a problem or something is noticed. So it's about 50-50 completely anonymous new throwaway accounts that are all pre-moderated, those comments, and about 40% of regular users, and then a small number of users who sign their comments, of which by far the largest volume is supplied by Elizabeth.
There's the ladies in the room.
Yes. Yeah. So she's probably the only experienced user who signs their comments. So for a while, the moderation guidelines changed and that stopped.
Yeah. Pretty interesting. There is another question online asking, is there any cooperation with Scope? And maybe we can expand that. Are journals following it proactively, what's happening on PubPeer?
Well, so I said that the overall impression is that not much happens. So that's not to say that people don't mean well, but the end result is not very convincing. And so what's very frustrating, and a point of kind of continuing discussion, Elizabeth, I'm sure, will mention that or could mention that, is when you see that, you know, the authors have cheated, we feel that, you know, the results really shouldn't be considered reliable, but somehow journals are perfectly happy as long as there's a picture where, you know, that lack of trust is no longer necessary. And so there's a big question, you know, if a manipulation or some sort of misconduct is apparent, what then should you do with the paper? So there are people that, you know, string them up, say it should just be retracted, and I have some sympathy with that point of view, but that's not what happens generally. And it is actually a COPE. So the COPE guidelines are quite messy. So the headline retraction guideline is just say that the main conclusion has to be unreliable. And it doesn't matter if you no longer trust the authors, or at least, I don't know, journals convince themselves that they can always trust the authors, even if they're so. It doesn't really happen.
So that's not a very strict criterion. Eh? That's your point.
Then they're just not very clear, actually, to be honest.
I can imagine. Well, Boris, I'd like to thank you again for the presentation and the Q&A. Thank you for being here. And let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the questions.
It was great.